Hello, fifth graders. You're joining me for chapter 9 of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. And we are meeting Harry and Hermione and the Weasleys right after the Quidditch World Cup. So this is following directly after the game. Remember, Ireland won and Bulgaria lost by 10 points, but Victor Crumb, the Seeker, he got the snitch. And so it wasn't a total loss for Bulgaria, but Ireland did win, and so they're all celebrating right now. Chapter 9. The Dark Mark. "Don't tell your mother you've been gambling," Mr. Weasley implored Fred and George, as they all made their way slowly down the purple-carpeted stairs. "Don't worry, Dad," said Fred gleefully. "We've got big plans for this money. We don't want to get it confiscated." Mr. Weasley looked for a moment as though he was going to ask what these big plans were, but seemed to decide upon reflection that he really didn't want to know. They were soon caught up in the crowds near the flooding out of the stadium, and back to their campsites. Ruckus singing was borne towards them on the night air as they retraced their steps along the lantern-lit path, and leprechauns kept shooting over their heads, cackling and waving their lanterns. When they finally reached the tents, nobody felt like sleeping at all, and given the level of noise around them, Mr. Weasley agreed that they could all have one last cup of cocoa together before turning in. They were soon arguing enjoyably about the match. Mr. Weasley got drawn into a disagreement about cobbing with Charlie, and it was only when Ginny fell asleep right at the tiny table and spilled hot chocolate all over the floor that Mr. Weasley called a halt to all the verbal replays, and insisted that everyone went to bed. Hermione and Ginny went into the next tent, and Harry and the rest of the Weasleys changed into their pajamas and clambered into their bunks. From the other side of the campsite they could still hear much singing and the odd echoing bang. "Oh, I'm glad I'm not on duty," said Mr. Weasley sleepily. "I wouldn't fancy having to go tell the Irish that they have to stop celebrating." Harry, who was on the top bunk above Ron, lay staring up at the canvas ceiling of the tent, watching the glow of an occasional leprechaun lantern flying overhead, and picturing again and again some of Crumb's more spectacular moves. He was itching to get back on his own firebolt and try out the Wonsky feint. Somehow, Oliver never managed to convey with all his wriggling diagrams that move and how it was supposed to look like. Harry saw himself in robes that had his name on the back and imagined the sensation of hearing a 100,000 strong roar as Ludo Bagman's voice echoed through the stadium. "I give you Potter!" Harry never knew whether he'd actually dropped off to sleep or not. His fantasies of flying like Crumb might well have slipped into actual dreams. All he knew that was quite suddenly Mr. Weasley was shouting, "Get up, Ron! Get up, Harry! Come on now, get up! This is urgent!" Harry sat up quickly, and the top of his head hid the canvas. "What's the matter?" Dimly he could tell something was wrong. The noises in the campsite had changed. The singing had stopped. He could hear screams and the sound of people running. He slipped down from the bunk and reached for his clothes, but Mr. Weasley, who had pulled his jeans over his own pajamas, said, "There's no time, Harry. Just grab a jacket and get outside, quickly." Harry did as he was told and hurried out of the tent, Ron at his heels. By the light of the few fires that were still burning, he could see people running into the woods, fleeing something that was moving across the field towards them, something that was emitting odd flashes of light and noises like gunfire. Loud jeering roars of laughter and drunken yells were drifting towards them, and then came a burst of strong green light which illuminated the scene. A crowd of wizards, tightly packed and moving together with wands pointing straight upwards, was marching slowly across the field. Harry squinted at them. They didn't seem to have faces. Then he realized that their heads were hooded and their faces were masked. High above them, floating along in mid-air, 4 struggling figures were being contorted into grotesque shapes. It was as though the masked wizards on the ground were puppeteers, and the people above them were marionettes, operated by invisible strings that rose from wands in the air. The 2 figures were very small. More wizards were joining the marching group, laughing and pointing up at the floating bodies. Tents crumpled and fell as the marching crowd swelled. Once or twice Harry saw one of the marchers blast a tent out of the way with his wand, and several caught fire. The screaming grew louder. The floating people were suddenly illuminated as they passed over a burning tent, and Harry recognized one of them, Mr. Roberts, the campsite manager. The other three looked as though they might be his wife and children. One of the marchers below flew Mrs. Roberts upside down with his wand. Her nightdress fell down to reveal her real voluminous drawers. She struggled to cover herself up as the crowd below screeched and hooted with glee. "That's sick," Ron muttered, watching the smallest Muggle child, who had begun to spin like a top, 60 feet above the ground, his head flopping limply from side to side. "That is really sick." Hermione and Ginny came hurrying towards them, pulling coats over their nightdresses, and Mr. Weasley right behind them. At the same moment, Bill, Charlie, and Percy emerged from the boys' tent fully dressed with their sleeves rolled up and their wands out. "We're going to help the Ministry of Magic," Mr. Weasley shouted over all the noise, rolling up his sleeves. "You lot, get into the woods and stick together. I'll come and fetch you when we're sorted this out." Bill, Charlie, and Percy were already sprinting away towards the oncoming marchers. Mr. Weasley tore after them. Ministry wizards were dashing from every direction towards the source of the trouble. The crowd beneath the Roberts family was coming ever closer. "Come on," said Fred, grabbing Ginny's hand and starting to pull her towards the wood. Harry, Ron, Hermione, and George followed. They all looked back as they reached the trees. The crowd beneath the Roberts family was larger than ever. They could see the Ministry wizards getting through. They could see the Ministry wizards trying to get through it to the hooded wizards in the center, but they were having great difficulty. It looked as though they were scared to perform any spell that might break the Roberts family and make them fall. The colored lanterns that had lit the path to the stadium had been extinguished. Dark figures were blundering through the trees. Children were crying, anxious. Shouts and panicked voices were reverberating around them in the cold night air. Harry felt himself being pushed hither and thither by people whose faces he could not see. Then he heard Ron yell with pain. "What happened?" said Hermione anxiously, stopping so abruptly that Harry walked into her. "Ron, where are you? Oh, this is stupid. Lumos!" She illuminated her wand and directed it towards the narrow beam across the path. Ron was lying sprawled on the ground. "I tripped over a tree root," he said angrily, getting to his feet again. "Well, with feet that size, it's hard not to," said a drawling voice from behind. Harry, Ron, and Hermione turned sharply. Draco Malfoy was standing alone nearby them, against the tree, looking utterly relaxed, his arms folded. He seemed to have been watching the scene on the campsite through a gap in the trees. Ron told Malfoy to do something that Harry knew he would have never dared say in front of Mrs. Weasley. "Language, Weasley," said Malfoy, his pale eyes glittering. "Hadn't you better be hurrying along now? You wouldn't want her spotted, would you?" He nodded at Hermione, and at the same time a blast like a bomb sounded from the campsite, and a flash of green light momentarily lit the trees around them. "What's that supposed to mean?" said Hermione defiantly. "Granger, they're after Muggles," said Malfoy. "Do you want to be showing off your knickers in midair? Because if you do, hang around. They're moving this way, and it would give us all a great laugh." "Hermione's a witch," Harry snarled. "Have it your own way, Potter," said Malfoy, grinning maliciously. "If you think they can't spot a mudblood, then stay right where you are." "You watch your mouth!" shouted Ron. Everyone present knew that mudblood was a very offensive term for a witch or wizard of Muggle parentage. "Never mind, Ron," said Hermione quickly, seizing Ron's arm to restrain him as he took a step towards Malfoy. There came a bang from the other side of the trees that was louder than anything they'd heard. Several people nearby screamed. Malfoy chuckled softly. "Scare easily, don't they?" he said lazily. "I suppose your daddy told you all to hide? What's he up to, trying to rescue the Muggles?" "Where are your parents?" said Harry, his temper rising. "Out there wearing masks, are they?" Malfoy turned his face to Harry, still smiling. "Well, if they were, I wouldn't be likely to tell you, now would I, Potter?" "Oh, come on," said Hermione with a disgusted look at Malfoy. "Let's go and find the others." "Keep that big bushy head down, Granger," sneered Malfoy. Come on, Hermione repeated, and she pulled Harry and Ron up off the path again. I'll bet you anything his dad is one of the masked lot, said Ron hotly. Well, with any luck, the Ministry will catch him, said Hermione fervently. Oh, Malfoy. Believe this. Where have the others got to? Fred, George, and Ginny were nowhere to be seen, though the path was packed with plenty of other people, all of them looking nervously over their shoulders toward the commotion back at the campsite. A huddle of teenagers in pajamas was arguing vociferously a little way along the path. When they saw Harry and Ron and a girl with thick curly hair, they turned and said quickly, "Oui est, Madame Maxime? Nous avons perdu." What?" said Ron. "Oh," the girl had spoken, turned back to him as they walked distinctly by her, and she said, "Hogwarts." Beauxbatons, muttered Hermione. "Sorry?" "They must go to Beauxbatons," said Hermione. "You know, Beauxbatons Academy of Magic. I read about it in an appraisal of magical education in Europe." "Oh, yeah, right," said Harry. "Fred and George can't have gone that far," said Ron, pulling out his wand, lighting it like Hermione, and squinting up the path. Harry dug into the pockets of his jackets for his own wand, but it wasn't there. The only things he could find were his binoculars. "Oh, no, I don't believe it. I've lost my wand." "You're kidding." Ron and Hermione raised their wands high enough to spread the narrow beams of light further on the ground. Harry looked around him, but his wand was nowhere to be seen. "Maybe it's back in the tent," said Ron. "Maybe it fell out of your pocket when we were running," Hermione suggested anxiously. "Yeah," said Harry, "maybe." He usually kept his wand with him at all times in the Wizarding World, and finding himself without it in the midst of a scene like this made him feel very vulnerable. A rustling noise made all three of them jump. Winky, the house elf, fighting her way out of a clump of bushes nearby. She was moving in the most peculiar fashion, apparently with great difficulty. It was as though someone invisible was holding her back. "There is bad wizards about," she squeaked distractedly, as she leant forwards and labored to keep running. "People, high in the air! Winky is getting out of the way!" And she disappeared into the trees on the other side of the path, panting and squeaking as though she fought the force that was restraining her. "What is up with her?" said Ron, looking curiously after Winky. "Why can't she run properly?" "Bet she didn't ask permission to hide," said Harry. He was thinking of Dobby. Every time he tried to do something the Malfoys wouldn't like, he had been forced to start beating himself up. "You know, house elves have a very raw deal," said Hermione indignantly. "It's slavery, that's what it is. That Mr. Crouch made her go up to the top of the stadium, and she was terrified. And now he's got her bewitched so she can't even run when they start trampling tents. Why doesn't someone do something about it?" "Well, the elves are happy, aren't they?" Ron said. "You heard old Winky back at the match. House elves is not supposed to have fun. That's what she likes, being bossed around. It's people like you, Ron," Hermione began hotly, "who prop up rotten and unjust systems just because they're too lazy to—" Another loud bang echoed from the edge of the wood. "Let's just keep moving, shall we?" said Ron. And Harry saw him glance edgily at Hermione. Perhaps there was truth in what Malfoy said. Perhaps Hermione was in more danger than they were. They set off again, Harry still searching his pockets even though he knew his wand wasn't in there. They followed the dark path deeper into the wood, still keeping an eye out for Fred, George, and Ginny. They passed a group of goblins that were cackling over a sack of gold they undoubtedly won on betting the match, and who seemed quite unperturbed by the trouble in the campsite. Further still along the path, they walked into a patch of silvery light, and when they looked through the trees, they saw 3 tall and beautiful villas standing in the clearing, surrounded by a gaggle of young wizards, all of whom were talking very loudly. "I pull down about 100 sacks of galleons a year," one of them shouted. "I'm a dragon killer for the Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures." "No, you're not," yelled his friend. "You're a dishwasher at the Leaky Cauldron." "But I'm a vampire hunter. I've killed about 90 so far." A third young wizard, whose pimples were visible even by the dim silvery light of the villa, now cut in. I'm about to become the youngest minister of magic ever, I am." Harry snorted with laughter. He recognized the pimply wizard. His name was Stan Shunpike, and he was in fact a conductor on the triple-decker night bus. He turned to tell Ron this, but Ron's face had suddenly gone slack, and the next second Ron was yelling, "Did I tell you I've invented a broomstick that'll reach Jupiter?" "Honestly," said Hermione again, and she grabbed Harry and Ron firmly by the arms, wheeled him around, and marched him away. By the time the sounds of the villa and their admirers had faded completely, they were at the very heart of the wood. They seemed to be alone now. Everything was much quieter. Harry looked around. "I reckon we can just wait here, you know. We'll hear and see anyone coming about a mile off." The words were hardly out of his mouth when Ludo Bagman emerged from behind a tree right ahead of them. Even in the feeble light of the two wands, Harry could see that a great change had come over Bagman. He no longer looked buoyant and rosy-faced. There was no more spring in his step. He looked very white and strained. "Who's that?" he said, blinking down at them, trying to make out their faces. "What are you doing in here, all alone?" They looked at each other surprised. "Well, there's sort of a riot going on," said Ron. Bagman stared at him. "What?" "On the campsite, some people have got a hold of a family of muggles." Bagman swore loudly. "Darn them!" he said, looking quite distracted, and without another word he disapparated with a small pop. "Not exactly on top of things, Mr. Bagman, is he?" said Hermione, frowning. "He was a great beater, though," said Ron, leading the way off the path into a small clearing, and sitting down on dry grass at the foot of a tree. "The Wimborne Wasps had won the league 3 times in a row while he was with them." He took his small figure of Crumb out of his pocket, set it down on the ground, and watched it walk around for a while, like the real Crumb. The model was slightly duck-footed and round-shouldered, much less impressive on his splayed feet than on his broomstick. Harry was listening out for noise from the campsite. Everything seemed still and quiet. Perhaps the riot was over. "I hope the others are okay," said Hermione after a while. "They'll be fine," said Ron. "Imagine if your dad catches Lucius Malfoy," said Harry, sitting down next to Ron and watching the small figure of Crumb slouching over the fallen leaves. "He's always said he'll get something on him." "That'd wipe the smirk off old Draco's face, all right," said Ron. "Those poor muggles, though," Hermione said nervously. "What if they can't get them down?" "They will," said Ron reassuringly. "They'll find a way." "Mad, though, to do something like that when the whole Ministry of Magic is out here tonight," said Hermione. "I mean, how do they expect to get away from it? Do you think they've been drinking, or are they just—" But she broke off abruptly and looked over her shoulder. Harry and Ron looked quickly around, too. It sounded as though someone was staggering towards the clearing. They waited, listening to the sounds of uneven steps behind the trees. But the footsteps came too sudden to a halt. "Hello?" There was a silence. Harry got to his feet and peered around the tree. It was too dark to see very far, but he could sense somebody standing just beyond the range of his vision. "Who's there?" And then, without warning, the silence was broken by a voice unlike anything they've ever heard in the wood. And it muttered, not a panic shout, but what sounded like a spell. "Mors Madre!" And something vast and green and glittering erupted from the patch of darkness Harry's eyes had been struggling to penetrate. It flew up over the treetops and into the sky. "What the—" Ron gasped as he sprang to his feet again, staring up at the thing that had appeared. For a second, Harry thought it was another leprechaun formation. Then he realized that it was a colossal skull, composed of what looked like emerald stars, with a serpent protruding from the mouth. As they watched it, it rose higher and higher, blazing in the haze of a greenish smoke, etched against the black sky like a new constellation. Suddenly, the wood all around them erupted with screams. Harry didn't understand why, but the only possible cause was the sudden appearance of the skull, which had now risen high enough to illuminate the entire wood. Like some grisly neon sign, he scanned the darkness for the people who had conjured the skull, but he couldn't see anyone. "Who's there?" he called again. "Harry, come on, move!" Hermione seized the back of his jacket and was tugging him backwards. "What's the matter?" Harry said, startled to see her face so white and terrified. "It's the dark mark, Harry," Hermione moaned, pulling him as hard as she could. "You know whose sign?" "Voldemort's? Harry, come on!" Harry turned. Ron was hurriedly scooping up his miniature crumb, and the three of them started across the clearing. But before they had taken more than a few hurried steps, a series of popping noises announced the arrival of 20 wizards appearing from thin air surrounding them. Okay, so that's where we're going to stop. We're about halfway through chapter 9 right now. I want you guys to write your predictions below, and I will continue reading on Monday, and we're going to find out who these wizards are popping up around Harry and Hermione and Ron, and also why the dark mark was conjured, Voldemort's mark. Have a wonderful weekend, guys.